Well, yeah, that's why I'm shooting this little test, is because the real logistics of where we can fit the camera and actually get a shot and get the scene and then sort of tell the story, which is out here somewhere.
It was amazing when George presented Phantom Menace to us. The idea that we could even do it in time or even do it at all seemed pretty much impossible. But we all just focused on it and just said, okay, let's do this, and divided the show up. The work was always conceived from the beginning to not so much do synthetic CG backgrounds, but to try to have those all be real, real locations, real miniatures that we could do some work on. But the CG was used for the characters and for the compositing. And that's, I think, was really a good way to go, because at that time we didn't really have the tools to make landscapes and all look very real. And any time, I still feel this, any time that you can start with something real, you should use it, because it forces the work up to that level. And I think that combination of the two always keeps you sort of on your toes. Is this real or is this fake? But you buy into it and you believe it.
In The Phantom Menace, we visit Naboo, which is the home planet of the Queen. And it's a critical planet because it's kind of the center of, the start of Episode 1. And for the aesthetic of it, it was really interesting because, at this time, this was before the Empire, and George really wanted to create an aesthetic where it was a mix of different styles. And in some ways, it was a lot more romantic.
Yeah, and even here, you could put ivy sort of growing up.
It's a society that's very integrated in terms of technology with nature. And once we settled on that idea, it really grounded the look of the planet.
The big battle was pretty difficult at the time, because nobody up until that time had done a synthetic battle with like thousands of soldiers or people fighting each other, creatures fighting each other. It's been done a lot since, but that was, as far as I know, it's the first time it had really been done without using real people, all computer graphics. We didn't do any sort of crowd simulations or anything like that with emotions. They were all real motion capture or hand animated characters all the time that we just replicated over and over and shifted them around a little bit so that you couldn't tell one character was moving the same way as another. But then they get into a battle and we've got all the traditional sort of more Star Wars-y type explosions and stuff like that. And we used everything we could think of. Mostly there was a lot less computer graphics than people might think. We did a lot of stuff with real explosions, real miniature ships that you see going along on the ground that crash. We had a really nice model shop here, and at the time that seemed to be the best way to do it. And I still think it was, because it looks pretty good.
On Naboo, there is these other society, which is complementary to the Queen's world, which are the Gungans. And it was really interesting because George had this brilliant idea of creating sort of this underwater society. The Gungans actually had this technology of force fields, and they can create these bubbles underneath the ocean. And that was a really fun thing to explore, because visually it's stunning, of course, because you're literally in a world of windows. One of the wonderful challenges that George kind of laid on all of us was, okay, we're going to create something visually stunning, but he also wanted to really lay down the foundation that it had to look believable. It had to have logic and in a sense that, no, this world really could exist.
It really has to do with when you see the cut sequence. He's way down at the end of the tunnel. It's real tiny.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of say, oh, monster.
Okay.
The underwater sequence, I'd always wanted to do something like that, and especially wanted to do something with sort of that manta ray designed ship. George was pretty open in shot designs, and I came up with a lot of the stuff that showed the different size scales of the fish, how to, with ideas about how to set the shots up so that you always thought you were seeing a bigger fish, which is sort of the punchline to the entire sequence.
When I first saw the finished film, I was really thrilled. I mean, it was in many ways what we saw in our mind's eye come to life. I spent, literally years working on the planet itself, trying to design the aesthetic for it. And the execution by ILM was just flawless. I mean, it just looked great.
First off, it's an extraordinary story. It's the first story in the Star Wars cycle, And it's a great adventure story. And that's what I saw first when I read it and saw the photographs and the descriptions of these extraordinary planets and worlds that my character and various other characters explore and find themselves involved with. Second or third reading, it was, it was like, oh yeah, there is this element to it now. Of course, these races of creatures and individuals and human pups, they all depend on each other here.
Our two great societies have always lived in peace. The Trade Federation has destroyed all that we have worked so hard to build. If we do not act quickly, all will be lost forever. I ask you to help us.
George is making a very, very strong point through entertainment of that life needs each other, you know what I mean? It's like a tree needs the ground it grows on, the ground then needs man to kind of look after it. And in fact, my character makes a statement to this little boy who becomes my apprentice. Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
Inside your cells, yes. And we are symbionts with them.
Symbionts?
Life forms living together for mutual advantage. That we wouldn't live unless we had them, and yet if we saw them under a microscope, we'd see these kind of nasty little bug-like things that your instant reaction would be to kill it, but that is life.
I don't understand.
With time and training, Annie, you will. You will. It's about harmony, I guess, but told in a wonderful, entertaining, as I say, way, and full of action and full of a very, very interesting basic philosophy that we all need to be reminded of.
That's it. Tatooine.
Tatooine is a key planet. Of course, it's where where we discover Anakin. And as it relates to the whole Star Wars universe, it's really the center of where it all starts. To actually have the opportunity to go back and build on those designs was fantastic. Of course, George wanted to push the boundaries even further, and so we took the design philosophy established by Ralph McQuarrie and others and started to really think, okay, how would this society actually function? I basically took, Luke's homestead, which is a really elegant design, and just extrapolated it out.
Tatooine's the only location in Episode 1 that we visit that's shared from the original trilogy, and so it was important to me that it still could feel like the same planet. Tunisia was a very difficult location, mostly because of the temperature. We ended up shooting starting end of July into the first part of August, when Anakin and Shmi are saying goodbye. That sequence, it was 126.5 degrees when we shot that scene. Those are temperatures I've never experienced before, and I hope I never experience again.
I don't think they're going to need to build anything. I mean, they need to build just a little tiny bit of the ramp on a blue screen set.
The effects work is mostly set extensions. So when the Queen ship is parked in the desert, we really just had the ramp there. Any of the wider views was an 8-foot-long miniature that we had of the ship and splitting that all in. We had set extensions inside of the Mos Espa city. The set build went up to about 12 feet, and then we extended it and made the city larger and populated it. We added droids and other creatures.
As George was writing the story, he needed a centerpiece for this big action sequence, which was this huge race, which we called the pod race. We started researching Southwest in terms of butte formations, looking at the Grand Canyon for rocks, looking literally everywhere we could find exotic rock formations in the desert, and we just merged them all together.
A lot of shots were traveling at tremendous speed, and at the beginning of a shot, something that's way on the far end, way out on the horizon, would be going past camera. So it either meant tremendously large miniatures or helicopter plates, but exotic terrains that George wanted didn't really exist anywhere. That really leaves computer graphics of some kind as about the only real solution. To begin with, we started in the hangar beforehand. We had a partial set that we shot in Leavesden in England. And then the large pod race arena was about a 40-foot miniature that we shot out in the back lot, back at ILM, populated largely with ILM employees. It was a combination of computer-generated people and blue screen elements that we shot for mid-range shots, and then for shots in the pod race, we're actually flying through the arena. We had a bunch of colored Q-tips that were in the stands, and by playing fans across the back of it, you could get some subtle motion in the crowd so that they have an appearance of being alive. George pointed out that the thing about Tatooine is the skies aren't blue, that they actually have a grayness to them. And when we were in Tunisia, he's exactly right. You have this kind of yellowish dust that gets swept up into the sky and is kind of suspended in the air. And that yellowish tone of the dust neutralizes the blue of the sky and kind of adds up to a kind of a grayish horizon. And so we tried to make sure that that was always present in the shots that we did.
It was very interesting to build 18-pod engines, the engines and the pods. Well, the engines are the size of 747 engines. I mean, they're just huge. They're 20, 25, 30 feet long, 12 to 15 feet wide, which is over the maximum that any truck is allowed to take. And that becomes immediately a challenge. And it's also something we could never have done in the heat of Tunisia. It just would have been impossible. I think all of the engines took about 12 weeks to build. To have that kind of crew working in that kind of environment would have been very, very difficult. And it was much easier to build them and then transport them. The transport was fantastic, though. It was a really major thing. We could only drive at night. We had ferries that we had to put them on. We even flew a lot of the engines in a Russian MTV 800, which is the largest transport plane in the world. That was a lot of fun. Well, one of the problems about Episode 4, A New Hope, was that none of the records really remained for Tunisia. They hadn't had an opportunity to really find all the locations before they went there. They were on the move from the main part of Tunisia to a little island called Jerba, and no one had kept accurate records of where every single location was. And since we were not replicating them, but we were going to be in the same world, we wanted to try and find an area that would be much simpler than Episode 4 was to shoot. And we needed to find an area that would combine all the elements of all the disparate locations that they went to. As it turned out, there was a very interesting article that had been given to me at Lucasfilm about a young guy who was getting his PhD. He was an archaeologist, and he decided to make archaeology very fun. So his thesis was written on where were the original locations on Episode 4. And as soon as I read it, I realized he was the only guy. He'd spent months and months in the desert tracking down every single location. So I called him up. He was a really nice guy. And we sent him out to Tunisia, and we met him there. He immediately proceeded to show us where all of the locations, because all of us were obviously not on the original Star Wars. When we were traveling with David throughout all the areas, there was one little section in Jerba whereas the main cantina was, and it had been rebuilt. It was a brand new modern street. I mean, there were basically condominiums surrounding it, and there was no way to actually picture where the original cantina was. But David knew precisely where it was because he had been there years before, and we were trying to talk to someone, and he took us into his garden. And as we were walking into his house, we saw one of the original cupolas in his garden, which he was now growing vegetables in. And we suddenly started to discover pieces. And we found the actual original cantina door about a quarter of a mile away. And it was being used as a door to protect a chicken farm. It was just fantastic, absolutely fantastic. We saw it in the middle of nowhere. So there were little pieces, and we saw an older man, maybe in his late 80s, walking down the street with the original Star Wars t-shirt, and I didn't have the heart to tell him that that was probably worth $10,000 now.
Coruscant is the sort of the home planet of the Republic at this point. It's the center planet. It's basically a planet made entirely of cities.
Since there's really no locations you can go shoot, everything you see has to be fabricated. And it was a combination of partial sets and a lot of miniatures and computer graphics, matte paintings, kind of every technique we could throw at it.
It was an interesting design challenge in the sense that, how do you create this world that's completely built out and yet still make it kind of, attractive so that it becomes the symbol of power in the Republic? Where you start to look not sort of at an individual building level, but at a planetary level, where you start really looking at it and treating each city as if it was one particular building and how would it flow out.
We had experimented a little bit with the look of Coruscant, actually, for one of the end shots of the Return of the Jedi Special Edition. We have a series of vignettes of celebrations happening, and one of them is a little glimpse of Coruscant.
So what we did was we started to go with monumental styles, architecture that we're very familiar with, stone architecture, classic architectures, forms that we're very familiar with in New York. Taking those forms and then literally multiplying them by 1,000, if not more, and just exaggerating the scale. What you're seeing rings familiar, but yet the scale is of such a crazy proportion that it kind of makes your jaws drop and say, wow, this society must be pretty amazing to build structures of this scale.
A major feature of the planet is this constant strings of flying traffic. So everywhere you look, there's these lanes of flying cars. Weren't real hard to do. Probably about 20 or so different vehicle designs with color variations in them, and then they're assembled into lanes of traffic, and then those lanes of traffic got reused over and over again, going different directions. We would do occasional sweeteners. When you saw crossed strings of traffic, we would animate a couple of vehicles that would change lanes, go from one string to another. So you can occasionally see that in the background. Probably the biggest challenge dealing with Coruscant is getting enough variety. You don't want to see the same building over and over again. You want to see consistent architectural themes, but it needs to look like every building is unique. There were probably about 24 different distinct 3D models that we built. Buildings that were repurposable, that you could take pieces off of them and assemble them in different ways, and that turned 90 degrees, it would look a little bit different, or you could have lights on one and not on another. And those got painted on top of to make more complete skylines.
One of the really fun environments to design was the Jedi Temple. George wanted something very monumental, but he also wanted something very spiritual. And so we came up with the idea that it was going to be these 5 giant towers, and the Jedi Council being in the top of the very center one. It's in some ways almost religious. And if you think about it, you have this vast planet, and yet the Jedi Temple is on top of that, and they have the highest point looking down. The counterpoint that the Senate chamber was going to be more like a big mushroom dome, and then it's all internal. Everything is on the inside part of it. And so you have these two contrasting forms, a very vertical sort of spiritual aerial place countered with the sort of a dome, almost cave-like environment for the Senate chamber.
One of my favorite things about the Coruscant scenes are at night when you see way off in the distance. We did this nice heat shimmer effect that you see in big cities. Heat shimmer that would be visible as a twinkling of the lights, and we did that in the nighttime scene in the Jedi Council chamber, the landing platform when they depart to head back home, and then there's a nighttime scene in Palpatine's apartment that we put that in. I was pleased with how that effect turned out, and it was did a lot to help add depth to the backgrounds. The Palpatine's apartment set was notable just because it was the very first thing we shot on the first day of principal photography on Episode 1.
Good luck, everybody. Now let's kick ass. 77, take 1.
And action!
So after a gap from 1982 to 1997, that was our first rolling of cameras on Star Wars.
Doing the Star Wars films is, every time you do one, it's like a new adventure. It's like running the Indy 500 every year. I mean, just every time you do it, even no matter how many times you've done it, it's the same challenge. And there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to pull it off at all. When I do these three, then it's finished. I've kind of done the story, and I feel I've accomplished what I set out to do originally, even more so, because what I really set out to do was the first 3. I didn't even think I would get the first 3 done until after the films came out. And then when the films came out, I realized not only could I finish the other 2, but I could also tell a backstory if I really wanted to, because that's a good story. It's fun to go back into that world. I get to do a lot of things now that I couldn't do before. which is going to be exciting in terms of writing and stuff. I can create things that weren't possible to create before. I was always, and I will be on this, but I've always been sort of at the limit of what is possible in terms of storytelling. Things have advanced so far in the last 20 years in terms of your ability to portray things on the screen that were just literally impossible before, and then very difficult in terms of cost. It's always a limiting factor. But even if you take that out, there were things that just couldn't be done regardless of how much money you had. One of the problems I had with Yoda is that, for instance, is that he couldn't move more than 6 feet in any one thing, and I couldn't show his legs. So I couldn't show him in a wide shot, and I couldn't show him running, jumping, or walking, really, any distance. We had to sort of rig backpacks and things to make him, to be able to transport him places. Now I can make him move anywhere I want. It's a great asset to be able to have a lot of the creatures that couldn't move before be able to move. So I hopefully will be able to get closer to what I am putting down on the page and what I imagine things to be like. The process of writing is not easy. And it takes a great deal of concentration, and you get into a particular place and you stay there for a while, and then you get, as you move around in that world, you can sort of see the things that are going on. And it's not something you can pop in and out of that easily. You know, I'm sort of running the story over in my mind all the time, and sort of contemplating various scene fits. What would it be like if we did this? What if I started there? What if, because there's point of view, there's a lot of mechanics that have to happen. And then there's, the entertainment values, which is, is it funny? Does it move things forward? Is it exciting? All those kinds of issues. So I'm finally glad to be working on my own again. It's great to be able to sit by myself and just do this. It's like a real luxury, actually. And, I don't feel a lot of pressure. It's kind of fun. I mean, I'm getting to do a lot of research, which I love to do, and I'm getting a chance to think. Things are quiet. It's very contemplative, and it's a great change from where I've been.
In episode 1, Coruscant is mostly depicted at a distance. We're flying over it, or we see it out of windows. And in episode 2, George wanted to get down to street level.
It started with this big, aerial car chase where we start to go down to the street. We start to see, okay, well, this is what the rest of Coruscant, the inhabitants, what do they do? And you start to get a hint of, okay, well, there's much more to this than just the governmental planet.
The chase begins in the new city where the buildings are much taller and more modern. And we drop down through an older city. There was an industrial area and kind of a seedy nightclub area. Most of the speeder chase is synthetic elements of one kind or another. What we have from live action photography is Ewan hanging off of the probe droid. We have Anakin in the yellow speeder, and then he catches up with Obi-Wan. We have Zam Wessel in her speeder. And that's about it for set pieces until the crash. When the speeder crashes, we had a little bit of a street scene set piece, and then the entrance to the nightclub.
She went into the club, Master.
The design challenge there was to try something, kind of a spin on the cantina sequence from the original Star Wars, and then see what we can do with it. And instead of making it so chaotic and sort of really kind of interesting in a seedy way that we saw on Tatooine, we wanted to take the approach that, okay, well, this is a festive place. This is still, a place where, young people go and celebrate and stuff, and you have all this intrigue going around it. And so we, of course, filled it with color and sound and music.
That set was under construction for probably 6 or 8 weeks, gradually building it up. Took quite a while to get it to its shootable state. And we shot on it for, I think it was less than a whole day. I think it was about 2/3 of a day. And then the next day they were tearing it all apart. Large parts of it were going into the dumpster. And it just seems like such a tragic thing, so much effort goes into those sets. But we needed that space to put the next set in.
Dexter's Diner is a perfect example of where we took iconic American images and then pulled it together, for a real important story point. It was a really fun thing because George wanted literally a diner, and he knew exactly what he wanted. Some of the earlier designs were quite expansive. We had circular ones, we had seating in different arrangements, but it all became a little bit too exotic. They're not the classic American diner that we're all familiar with. And so we actually went very simple and just literally took the original design of what we would see in a diner and then just modified it a little bit, put in a couple robots, set it at the bottom of this gigantic street on Coruscant, and you had this fantastic environment. The Jedi Library was a really fun challenge in the sense that, how do you create this information resource for all of the Republic? Basically, this is where every piece of information is stored. And so we took that idea and really, again, exaggerate the scale and then really try to think forward and say, well, what kind of technology would they use to store information? Of course, holograms are, already been established. So we decided, okay, these are all holographic databases. And then the next task was then to, okay, visually, how do you convey that so we can actually understand it? And we started looking at research of different libraries through all of history. In many ways, even though you only see such a small glimpse of it in the film, all this rich history was all figured out and planned. Depending on what George wants for the story, we start pulling bits and pieces of it. But if you dive into it, every little piece in terms of the structure of where these locations were and the look of them all tied together. So there's this incredible sense of history for the planet. And that's what really grounds the look of all of these films to make it look very believable.
The first movie I ever saw in the cinema could possibly have been Star Wars Episode 4. And I went to see it with my brother after school one day. We were going I lived in a town called Crieff, and my mum and dad were taking us to a big town in Scotland called Glasgow. And we were going to see Star Wars. And we were going to see it mainly because my uncle was in it.
And action. My scope shows the tower, but I can't see the exhaust port. Are you sure the computer can hit it?
And it was the first time I'd ever seen him in the cinema, in a movie. So we were very excited, and I remember being picked up outside the school gates by my mum and dad, and we got in the car and we were really excited all the way there. And then we sat down, just excited to see Uncle Dennis on the big screen. And then we got Star Wars as well, which blew us completely away.
All right, I've got a malfunction, Luke. I've got a malfunction, Luke. I can't stay with you.
Okay, Wedge, get clear.
Sorry.
Let him go. Stay on the leader.
So that was my first ever film, and I was 6.
As we go into episode 2, we revisit Naboo, and we actually get to see sort of the evolution of the planet. And it was key to the story because this is where Anakin and Padme really start to form their relationship. And it was really interesting in the sense that, all the other planets, we start to hint at a little bit of the mystery and the darkness. On Naboo, we actually want to exaggerate sort of the romance and the beauty and the light, to contrast what was starting to happen in the rest of the Star Wars universe. There's a dangerous trap in how do you create an incredible paradise, because everybody has a different idea of what that could be. And one of our goals was to really ground it into something that we're very familiar with. Of course, nature is an obvious one, because everybody loves nature, hopefully. And then how do you build enough architecture in there so that everything looks like it's in harmony? And so we decided to create architecture that was really perfectly situated into the natural surroundings. And Lake Como in Italy was actually a really good foundation for that, because it's a beautiful resort, a beautiful place to visit for vacations. And we just basically took that idea of that lake and then exaggerated it on a planetary scale, and that becomes the new Naboo. One of the environments on Naboo that we exaggerated the lighting and the architecture to make it more romantic is the Queen's Palace, her sort of secret retreat where she and Anakin actually start to fall in love. And what we did there was we really started to create a visual look with the lighting, so that it's always idyllic, it's always afternoon light, it's always perfect. You get a sense that it never thunderstorms on Naboo in this part of the world, that everything is always perfect, the lighting is always ideal.
That's beautiful.
That was one way to do it. The other one was to take the color palette of the flowers that we see around there and really just amp them up so everything was in full bloom, everything was in spring. And it's all these little subtle visual cues that you start to think that, okay, this planet is pretty special. I mean, it really represents paradise in that sense. And then these are Naboo buses. I like this one. One of the really interesting design challenges for Naboo was how do you merge technology with this very beautiful, peaceful society? The minute you start introducing vehicles and other high-tech things into a very naturalistic setting, there's a tendency to transform the environment into something dark, just by the nature of what it is. And one of the real challenges for Naboo was, okay, how do you blend those two? How do you create technology in terms of the vehicles and the spaceships and the architecture to, in many ways, complement the natural surroundings of their planet? And we went back and decided to treat everything as jewelry almost as artwork. So every little piece, every little detail in terms of the door frames, the doorknobs, all the way up to spaceships, everything was treated with the care of an artist in terms of everything being designed and handcrafted, hand-built, hand-lovingly manufactured. And that kind of gave it the perfect blend where you actually saw beautiful trees and this technology that actually became art. And so it was really blending art with nature. And that was one way to overcome sort of the dangers of how do you make a society very believable and yet without turning too dark.
We're in the middle of the desert. I've been here about 5 or 6 times before, this particular spot. Everything is exactly the same because a lot of this stuff was just left and it hasn't, it was still here.
I mean, one of the interesting things of, designing worlds that kind of have a story arc over 3 films over a span of, 20 plus years is really figure out, okay, how do you make the designs work? And in episode 2, when Anakin goes back to visit his home, the design of the architecture and the homestead all look exactly the same, but you have to give it a little bit of sense that time has passed, history has happened. And we did that by just, slightly altering stuff. So, for instance, when you go back and visit Watto's shop, it's not exactly the same environment, but you still have the same sense of history because when you go back, you are, in some ways, seeing the evolution of the planet as well.
Shut, Watto. Ting mi chasa hopa.
Tatooine is an interesting world in that we get a sense that it's a very old world. Old in the sense that the people that are living there have been there a long time, so the structures have been built up over time. And how do you create sort of a design aesthetic for a people that are kind of, basically just surviving? They're kind of on the outskirts of the known universe. Knowing that, they do have high technology, they have spaceships and stuff like that. What would they do? How would they modify their materials to create these gigantic structures? But maybe they don't have the building materials that we're used to. The whole design philosophy was kind of all about mud bricks, taking that and exaggerating the scale.
And we're set.
And action!
Jamel, Adam. Yeah, okay. Okay, once more.
One of the really fun design challenges was the Tusken Raiders. We were exposed to some of that in episode 4, but we didn't quite see, what they were about, their homestead and stuff like that. In episode 2, we actually got to go and really explore what they were in terms of their camp. And the design brief from George was that, these are, of course, nomads. They roam the desert. And the challenge was to really, how do you create sort of architecture and buildings and homes and stuff that kind of fit that lifestyle. So again, we went through research. We started looking at, okay, North American Indians, what do they do when they're sort of cleaning up and moving from location to location? And so we took the idea of, okay, maybe it's like something like a teepee structure, something that can be easily broken down, but yet is, at night can become a home. And so we started looking at that and started saying, okay, well, how can we take advantage of the exotic life that's on Tatooine? There's some of these gigantic creatures. And we thought, well, instead of, wood for the teepees, how about if there were giant tusks? And that started to create this sort of this weird dome-like shape that then we put animal skin on top of it. And by creating these teepee structures with these giant, enormous tusks, it started to create this very iconic image of teeth and flesh. And it was perfectly suited for what the society, what the Tusken Raiders were all about, because they're a very aggressive, savage people. And so design works beautifully when you can have those elements imbued in the visual in addition to sort of the bigger scheme of, how does it actually work? When we saw Tatooine on episode 2, it was really well done. I mean, again, for me, being such a Star Wars fan, I love playing in this universe, and to see more and more of that get on the screen is a real joy.
Hello. How might I be of service? I am C-3PO. Oh, the maker Oh, Master Annie, I knew you would return.
When we visit the planet Geonosis in episode 2, we start to see sort of this very interesting world, and we get to understand who created the droids. And it was really a fascinating idea from George, where you have these very high-tech robots, and yet they're being created by a very primitive race. And so the design was really to take, okay, well, how do you create that? How do you contrast the two? Because it had the potential to create something visually very stunning, where you have sort of the society of this hive mentality of these insect type characters, and yet they're creating this very elaborate, almost cutting edge technology at this time, which are the droid army, and the factories that go into that.
We wanted this sense of chaos with the droid factory. Again, there was a really good pre-visualization that existed for that, but it had been cut up and rearranged in the editing process, and it kind of was a little bit confusing what was going on. So we actually took a group of our artists and we went to see a car factory here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we also went to a foundry over in the East Bay to take a lot of references and textures and photographs of real-looking stuff. A lot of the machinery and the conveyor belts that they're on are all computer graphics, but a lot of the world of the factory, all the distant things, are big miniatures that we made. Again, just trying to mix it up. The combination of all these real textures that we'd shot and then trying to plan, exactly what is going on here and what is really happening was all aimed to try and make it sort of feel a bit more real to the audience watching.
Our foundation is always research. We went and looked at all these different kinds of insect dwellings, ants, termites, and see what they would build. And all we do is we take that and exaggerate the scale. And so we really, for the Geonosans, we took the idea of termite dwellings and then started to really grow them in a way that was really fantastic and changing the scale quite a bit. And then what you do from there is then you start adding in bits of high technology. Like, for instance, the conference room of the Geonosans, where you see their high-tech war room. Everything's very organic on the outside. It's all like mud and rock. And it's the simplicity of merging those two iconic images that make the design very successful.
We're visiting a planet we've never seen before, so there's a little more freedom to kind of go off to create something interesting and different.
There's another big set piece, which is the big arena battle, the execution arena, where we see all these crazy creatures and monsters try to eat our heroes.
And then the Jedi show up and a big battle ensues. We have thousands of droids, hundreds of Jedi battling them. The Geonosans flee. The clone troopers show up. It's a giant free-for-all.
I'd taken some maps of this area and I drew a little diagram of what I thought the Battle of Geonosis would look like. So this happens here, this happens here, this happens here. I used that with the maps to say, okay, here's where I'm going to shoot this part of the battle and here's where I'm going to shoot that part of the battle. It worked out pretty well. I mean, there was great previs, and I really felt like, one of the satisfying parts of the experience was the previs guys, when they started seeing the shots, were just so happy with what we were coming up with.
It's weird because as an actor, you don't really think about the action part of a film being all too important, or, important to your character at least. And in this, it is. And it's just so exciting, because you know what it looks like on screen when they're all lit up and the sounds are going. It's just cool. Nick Gillard is the fight master. Brilliant man. He choreographs the fights. He's just really good at what he does. He brings a story arc to the fights. The fights sort of become their own character. And that's all credited to Nick. Heaps of fun, too. And he cares so much, so he's on set every day making sure that everything goes right and that there's no variable for any chance of that something might go wrong. And if something does, he's the first one in there. In terms of the lightsaber fights, it's all choreographed and every move is distinct and pre-planned. He spends hours just premeditating how every, the angle of the saber should look. So he I think, picks and chooses from so many different types of martial arts and ways of fighting with swords, and sort of comes to his own medium his own way of fighting, the Jedi way of fighting.
Somebody asked me, I can't remember when, they said, what's it like when you work in front of a blue screen, you don't see anything, and there's nothing behind the camera, and you're not getting anything coming back from behind the camera, because there isn't anything there. And I said, oh, I've often had that experience with a lot of my colleagues.
It's hard because you take your attention off of the dialogue and sometimes off of what you're doing and just trying to remember, you know, I've got so many different marks and I wave my hand here and that moves there and that's really supposed to be, you know, a she and he's supposed to be something else and that's an alien. You've got so many more variables to play with that's distracting and sometimes lose your place.
What's my comm link doing on the floor? I could use a force to grab that, couldn't I?
There's something very rewarding about cracking a scene with other actors and shooting the scene and having achieved it. And with this, you're doing lines against a blue curtain, and it's really hard work. I mean, it's difficult to make that believable. I don't know if I have.
I think blue screen acting is maybe the purest form of acting because it's like being a little kid in a cardboard box and thinking it's a spaceship. And I mean, that's really the point you have to get to.
We were working with these creatures and, you know, there's a couple of scenes I wanted to be able to focus on where it is, you know? Because I think an audience would subconsciously recognize that, you know?
I don't have anything else, but credits will do fine.
You're always in a state of having to believe something that's not really there.
You're just remembering the lines and saying them, really. Or not remembering the lines and trying to say them, as the case may be. You will not win this time. What's your name, Dooku? I want to say it. Okay.
It's really a lot more thought. I mean, you have to imagine everything you're setting around you, sometimes even characters, and it's a very different skill.
For me, that's fun. I can do that because I did that as a kid. I mean, if you watch Disney movies and you watch Bugs Bunny cartoons and, you know, I pretended to be Yosemite Sam and everybody else, so my imagination's pretty fertile. I don't have a problem with, you know, being whatever somebody wants me to be. I can go with it.
It is done then.
I have to say, it then became liberating because, you know, when you're kids and you come out of the cinema having seen a great cowboy film and you kind of start giving it all that, you know, you're pretending there's a horse there. You're just, it's absolute pure imagination.
There's always a bigger fish.
I don't know, at times it feels like you're in an acting class sitting in a chair with your buddy. You know, oh, she went that way.
Where are you going? He went that way.
So you feel like a little bit of an ass when you're doing it, but they say it works.
I'm talking about the frustrations of doing it and whatever. They're real frustrations, and but they're made worthwhile when you see the finished product, definitely.
It is magic, of course. It is magic. Magic can be created in many ways, obviously, and it's like a conjurer goes in front of an audience and says, look, nothing up this sleeve, nothing up that sleeve, now come with me into my magic world.
Episode 3 begins in the space above Coruscant with a big space battle. All the space battles that had happened in the previous pictures were literally out in space. And what we were saying here was that this battle was still in the upper atmosphere. We weren't quite into space yet. And that gave us a license to do atmospherics. We could do smoke trails and flame. We could have hanging smoke and debris from damaged ships. And we could have drag on missiles. It's just a bit of a different look from how space battles had been treated previously.
Come on, R2, fight him off. Get him off this jet. Fighter thing.
One thing I thought was amusing about the Jedi Starfighter set that we had was that for the angles where we're looking at our characters front on, we shot through the front window of it. And when we were first setting those up, George didn't like the knees of the characters being right in front of the lens. And that was really the best access point, was through that front window. So we had the actors drop their knees down, but once you drop your knees down, your legs aren't bent anymore, and the only place for your feet to go is outside the front windows. So all those scenes where you see the characters piloting the craft, their feet are sticking out of the windows on the front.
Now, break right. Left. Ready? Let's do that again.
Some new Coruscant locations on Episode 3 included the Opera House, where Anakin has a private discussion with Palpatine. There's some cameos in that. I think George and his daughter are just outside the opera box. One of the things that's kind of fun about working on these pictures where the whole worlds have to be created is those worlds have to be populated. Who do you get to populate these worlds? You get the cheapest labor you can, which is ourselves. So Roger Guyette and Rob Coleman and I and Denise Ream, Jill Brooks, and Janet Lewin are all in an opera box that's the next one over. So it was all the producers and supervisors box. I'm also I'm Anakin's hand a couple of times. When Anakin is sliding down the elevator shaft, and there's a close shot of his hand catching the cables. That's actually my hand. There's a tight view of Anakin sort of twisting his lightsaber and cutting off Count Dooku's hands, and that's me as Anakin. One of the things that George likes to do, because I've seen him do it a number of times, is if there's some portion of a set that we've seen in a previous picture that was left unbuilt or was unseen in the picture, that's an opportunity to do something with it. In Episode 2, we had Palpatine's big, round, red office, and it was 270-degree set, so there was a 90-degree section that was left unbuilt for camera access. We built that missing section on Episode 3, and that's where the hallway that goes down to Palpatine's private secret office are. Similarly, Padme's apartment had been seen previously in Episode 2, but there were a couple areas that hadn't been established before. In a corridor that leads off of Padme's bedroom, there's a staircase that goes down to her veranda. It's a new part of the set that we hadn't seen previously. Another new area for Coruscant is the Imperial Rehabilitation Center. This is this emergency medical area that Anakin is taken with after he's so horribly injured on Mustafar. This is where he becomes Darth Vader.
Awaken him.
This was a very small partial set. We had just the floor and the table that he was on. The rest of it is a virtual digital environment. Astute viewers will notice that Yoda changes a little bit between Episode 2 and 3. Between Episode 2 and 3, subsurface scattering had been developed, and you can see it in the translucency in his ears. Tried to make sure that he still kind of looked like the same Yoda, but he was just a little bit better in Episode 3. Yoda has a lot of performance to do. He has a broad range of emotions he has to portray. And he has to do a lot of action. He has a very lengthy, involved fight with Palpatine in the Senate chamber and in the office below. The fight scene in the Senate chamber was a fun one to do, since we had seen the Senate chamber in the previous pictures as this important place for public discussion and policy setting, suddenly being used as the background for a big battle where they're throwing the pods around and they're smashing into each other, using them as weapons. It was nice graphically and a nice dramatic statement. I think by the time we got to Episode 3, we were pretty practiced at doing Coruscant, so that was one of the more straightforward environments we had to deal with.
Another happy landing.
I just kind of asked George one day if I could have a different colored lightsaber.
Good guys are green and blue, bad guys are red. That's just the way it works.
No purple lights?
You might get purple.
Then when I came back for some reason, we were getting ready to do something, he said, "Oh, I got something to show you." And he showed it to me. And he said, "It's just an experiment right now. I don't know if we're going to keep it." And it was there. But somehow or other, even though he had done it as an experiment, it was already on the website. and he let me keep it. And then Nick Gaylord graciously has been trying to figure out a really spectacular and kind of wonderful saber battle for me to do, and he's combined a lot of different styles of things so that it looks very good and it travels very well and it's pretty spectacular, and it actually makes me dominant, it makes me vulnerable, it kind of makes me sneaky in ways, it makes me strong. It shows a lot of different kinds of sides of Mace in the middle of this fight. It's almost like I've practiced for this death all my life. Mainly because I've been doing this death scene all my life in various forms, because I've always wanted to be this kind of Errol Flynn-like swashbuckler, and I did it with all my friends from the time I was like 2 or 3 years old. We had sticks and we sword fought through trees and off our porches and down hills and on our bicycles and everywhere else, and all of a sudden I'm battling my way through 3 and 4 rooms, and it's kind of like, finally, So I'm pleased with the drama of it all and the fact that it's clear that I'm standing there and I'm winning this battle actually even without Anakin's help up until he steps in and does what he does to turn the tide. And that, I go out the way I do. I've been begging not to die in my sleep or get stabbed in the back by, some clone, and it didn't happen. So I'm happy.
In Episode 3, Utapau's location of General Grievous's command base. This is a planet where there are these large sinkholes, and the cities are built on the inside walls of the sinkholes. Our thought about that was that the air pressure isn't sufficient up at the surface. It's not down till you're in the holes that there's enough air for comfortable breathing. Utapau had very little in the way of actual practical sets. There was a landing platform set that we repurposed to be where Obi-Wan lands originally. It's also Grievous's secret platform. Everything else was a combination of miniatures and matte paintings and computer graphics. The sinkhole itself was built at 2 different scales. We had a sinkhole that was about 6 feet in diameter and about 12 feet high that was a big foam sculpted miniature for the widest views of the city. And then we had a close-up section that just represents a small arc of one wall with a lot of buildings that could be reconfigured in different ways to appear to be different parts of the city. We had one Jedi starfighter full-size set piece that had been built. That starfighter needed to appear both in front of a blue screen and a green screen in different scenes, and it had to appear with different colored markings on it. To avoid blue markings in front of a blue screen or green markings in front of a green screen, we ended up with it painted a slightly violet color so that we didn't have a color blending problem. And the idea was then we would take the color of the panels and shift them back to do a hue change on them to get them back to the blue that they were meant to be. The one Utapau character that we see and talk to is Bruce Spence.
Greetings, young Jedi. What brings you to our remote sanctuary?
Who was in Road Warrior. He was the gyro captain in Road Warrior. I just really liked that picture, and it was fun to have that actor there in the Star Wars pictures. Not unlike the Geonosis arena in Episode 2, one of the big challenges dealing with Utapau was how many shots these backgrounds were visible in. Not wanting to be in the same situation where we had one asset that had to be photographed by multiple crews to get all the different pieces. We elected to take the model that had been built and we photographed it for a handful of hero shots where we got a really good look at it. But then for the dozens and dozens of shots where we needed to just have that in the background, we laser scanned the model. We used that to generate a CG surface. We took photography of the model and then projected that onto that surface. that allowed us to then create unique views of the city for dozens and dozens of backgrounds, so that those backgrounds could be created in parallel by many different artists. General Grievous's command center on Utapau is the central ball of one of the big Nemoidian battleships. It's called Level 10.
There's a huge fight in here between Grievous and it's a big fight. And then Grievous takes off.
Grievous gets on this big wheel motorcycle. Obi-Wan pursues him on the Boga lizard. Having a human being riding a CG creature is a challenging thing. Not so much for the close shots, because in the close shots you can be entirely on the live action and you don't see the split. You might just see a tail moving in the background or a head in the foreground. But where they're not connected, those shots are easier to deal with. And then the very wide shots, it's a computer-generated figure on a computer-generated character, so those are fairly easy to deal with. It's the mid-ground shots where we were close enough that we needed to shoot Ewan to be the character, but it had to go on the computer-generated lizard. And really getting the motion to match between the two, that's really the hard part. A successful strategy on the previous pictures had been that the elements that really needed to be in contact, where his legs actually are on the saddle, those would be computer generated. So for the most part, Obi-Wan's actually split at the waist on a lot of those shots.
Oh, I have a bad feeling.
Towards the end of episode 2, George would hint about the existence of the lava planet, which I had heard about when I was a kid, but always knew that we'd be ending up on this lava world. Of course, that's where the biggest, baddest lightsaber fight of the entire 6 movies takes place, when Obi-Wan has to fight Anakin finally. The savagery and crazed, extravagance of the environment kind of equals the storytelling about what's going on at that point.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
The process started with taking a walk around the ranch, daydreaming and saying, oh my gosh, we're here, taking a trip over to the archives and just getting inspired to follow the Joe Johnsons and the Ralph McQuarries of the world.
Kind of above the Golden Gate Bridge, in that type of rock, I took photos of the sort of twisted shale sedimentary rock. Might get some ideas.
The Mustafar stuff was approached the same way we approached all the stuff on Star Wars, where we would read a little bit of the script before George actually came up and talked to us about it. We'd have a bunch of ideas kind of floating around our head, and he liked to just let us kind of go for it a little bit. So he would say something very obscure and very minimal, like lava planet.
What does the planet do? I figured out what Mustafar is.
That's the jumping up point. Okay, is this a technological lava planet and they're controlling the lava, or is it a complete wild, primordial kind of a place? And ultimately ended up being kind of a blend of those two things, but we explored each kind of extreme.
This lava could all be liquid gold, liquid obsidian, liquid unobtainium, whatever.
It's a Star Wars movie. We wanted to kind of take all that inspiration, turn it on its side a little, not go right for every volcanic reference. I kind of look from other ways around, like dams, hydroelectricity. There's a lot of mega structure engineering with very heavy, it couldn't even be concrete, but steel or some kind of unknown material that's built by a very technologically savvy world to control the lava.
It's built on a volcano, and they're using the energy of the volcano or the minerals of the volcano or something like that to do whatever they're doing there.
Early on, we were specifically told by George, do not filter anything because you think it'd be too hard to do. We were really told flat out to press up against what was technologically achievable.
That's starting to look good. This is good. Not quite sure about that. That may be too much.
He did want clear and iconic shapes. Everything had to read as very distinct.
This gets into the toast factor, but it's a good toast factor.
Yeah.
So, and we'll kind of figure that one out.
The CG guys were doing fluid dynamic simulations of lava very early on, and that inspired us to keep going even further with potential scenarios for the fight.
This is a 134th scale environment of Mustafar, and we're getting ready to run our lava test.
Everything is looking really good.
The largest model physically on Episode 3 is definitely Mustafar. The size is somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 feet deep and 30 feet wide, with a 30-foot lava flow somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 feet wide. As the sequence evolves and we end up going further and further down the river towards the waterfall, those are all different miniatures that we use to accomplish that sort of pathway.
Do you want to be made out of chocolate or something? Yeah.
We also referred to real footage of lava and began to replicate the look of real crust.
This waterfall is flowing incredibly well.
The lava is made up of a number of different products. One of them is this product called methasil, and it's dyed orange. So when it flows, it looks like lava. When you see them fighting, doing their thing, underneath it all there's a physical model and lava and everything. But on top of that, you have all this other stuff that just adds a kind of scale to it. We shot in multiple passes so that when they composite it, they can use different elements, and so they could enhance the light or they could make the lava brighter and all these different things, so it gives you a bit more control. We've got elements of lava flying up in the air, smoke pouring through, there's ash blowing around, you know, there's cameras shaking, so when you watch the movie you've got some kind of visceral reaction to it. God, that looks hot.
What I'm most proud of is it reads immediately as Star Wars, and it held up to that expectation I had for 20 years or so.
I am becoming more powerful than any Jedi has ever dreamed of, and I'm doing it for you.
Hayden's character is obviously the one that's really going through the change, and mine is much more just reactive to that. Padme has a pretty centered self, that it's not that she goes through this big change internally, but that external things are changing around her, and she has to sort of make decisions to cope with that. If she had some different concept of, you know, government or what's right or morality, you know, she might have been able to stay with him, you know, if her loyalties to him were, you know, just sort of above everything. But Padme's a politician. She's been a leader of many people.
Naboo's system has been invaded by the droid army.
This is sort of combining being a woman with being a politician, which is an interesting combination we don't see much of. I think the role is really sort of what the true meaning of feminism in my sort of interpretation of it.
Look, whatever happens out there, follow my lead. I'm not interested in getting into a war here. As a member of the Senate, maybe I can find a diplomatic solution to this mess.
I think the true feminism is bringing what is particular to women, because we are different, that's undeniable, to the opportunities that men have. So it's not, you know, going into some place and just behaving like a man or necessarily desiring what men want just because you can get it.
And together, you and I can rule the galaxy.
And so rather than being consumed with the thirst for power, as many of the people around her do, both men and women, she stays true to her compassion and her belief in democracy and humanity.
If this body is not capable of action, I suggest new leadership is needed.
The opening crawl says it, you know, war. We had known all through working on Episode 2 that Episode 3 was going to be about the Clone Wars. It's going to be a war movie. The first week starting Episode 3 was George wanted to see 10 planets for the war to be happening on. That's all he said, is like, the war is happening, give me 10 planets. And following George's rules, they have to be completely distinct from one another within distinct architectural style, distinct color scheme, distinctly different places. So Kashyyyk was great to have a crack at. We immediately went back and watched the Star Wars Christmas special, which features Kashyyyk heavily, and we actually were inspired by a lot of the stuff that Ralph McQuarrie had done for that. A lot of that served as a direct inspiration actually for the way we took Kashyyyk. Originally, Kashyyyk was basically Bora Bora with giant 1,000-foot tall cantilevered trees. I mean, very colorful, very bright, vivid, the way the South Pacific is. Towards the end, George took that color out to kind of sell the wartime kind of somber aspect of it, but we always saw it as it's very Polynesian, very, very beautiful place.
The Kashyyyk environment has involved a miniature beach set, which was, I think it was 8th scale, so it's kind of G.I. Joe size. And then we also had the tree, which was done at a different scale, but the tree, which is where all the Wookiees hang out and do their thing. And that was a big model. It was about 12 feet high as a physical model, and it had some detachable branches and stuff so that we could reorganize it. So we could use one tree and shoot it multiple times and reorientate it so it appeared like there were more than one tree. So when you see the movie, you'll see sometimes 4 or 5 trees on the beach or something. Most of the time it's actually one tree that's just been sort of reorganized. It's a very different environment, and the great thing about Star Wars is you travel to all these other worlds and places, and when you see Kashyyyk, it's got a certain tone to it, and with these giant trees and the water and the lagoon and the mountains and everything, and then all of a sudden this battle breaks out, so it's kind of a Saving Private Ryan of Wookiee land,
The other Clone War worlds we had, there was Utapau, of course, and then there were other kind of. What ended up as Megiddo started out as an illustration of a glowing lightsaber Jedi hiding behind the hulk of a machine with a giant looming battle droid behind. I kept wanting to get grit and atmosphere, inspired by all the great war movies that we have, and there's certain colors and certain feels of different kind of war. So Megiddo actually started out as kind of a Europe Battle of the Bulge kind of a thing, in that it's snowing, ashes falling, that kind of a thing. It ended up being set on the Crystal Planet, but that same basic giant battle droids looming in ash versus these Jedi, that carries through till the end. Felucia was another thing. Vietnam, obviously. Beautiful jungle, right? The most beautiful rainforest is where this horrible apocalypse is taking place on. So Felucia started out with just one image of completely alien plants, kind of gummy bear material, but translucent, very kind of amphibian or fungal with a giant scale. We have what started out as Bridge World, which is what we always call it, which was originally Seleucami and then got renamed as Cato Nemoidia, which you see for a very brief second. We were going to go back in and see where the Nemoidians kind of lived in these opulent, literally gold-walled and velvet red floored, very kind of take off on a 15th century French, very extravagant architecture. And so we designed Cato Nemoidia to reflect their kind of complete greed and even they had walking around butler bots bringing wine to them and stuff like that, but everything's gold encrusted and stuff. George worked very closely with the animatics guys who would model and texture and light an entire set in a few hours. I would say 8 to 10 other planets that never get shown in the movie and were cut out. We also had Steven Spielberg working on his version of some of these sequences. So Steven wanted to play with not showing the death. For instance, when Aayla Secura is killed on Felucia, we see the camera boom up past these kind of pitcher plants. The camera's obscured by those, but we see the kind of what's going on by the implied explosions going on behind it. He had other ideas for how on Cato Nemoidia there was an aerial dogfight going on, but it was taking place in between giant columns of smoke where it's really hide and seek, where you're seeing this very visual storytelling about this realization that this really bad thing is happening as the Jedi are being murdered throughout the galaxy all at one time. I didn't know at the time how rapidly that montage was going to go. We took, a year's work and boiled it down into probably under 3 minutes of that montage. And in the end, the Clone War worlds that we came up with for these to happen on had to be, distinct and interesting, but, step out of the way for George to tell his story.